Before we get started in that stage, I want to welcome up our next panel, which is going to be entitled Node World. I'm going to welcome up Nolan for us to kick off today. Now, JP Morgan put out a stat late last year that the staking industry was about $9 billion in 2021 and was looking for that to grow in the next few years to over $40 billion. Nolan panel, I'll let you guys take it away and prove them wrong that's more.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Kyle. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We're talking about nodes today, and I'm wondering, does anyone know a little bit about the history of Bitcoin toxicity? Do some people know where it comes from? It's a pretty interesting little anecdote. And one of the origins of Bitcoin toxicity comes from actually the definition of running a node. It's called a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Well, the early toxic Bitcoiners believed if you weren't running a node, you're not a peer. You're just not a peer, right? You're just another person out there. And does anyone know this other little fact? Magna Carta, when basically the king's powers were abridged, it was the original lords in England who did it. They passed it in 1215. They call each other peers. They're peers, right? The lords are actual peers, sort of below the king. So today, we're talking about a whole new class of people that we realized were going to be important for the infrastructure around this, and that's people who are running nodes, not just as miners, but as something else. So today we've got a great group of panelists here, and we're going to be talking all about nodes and what an important piece they are to the puzzle, and how peer-to-peer is actually a whole new business model. So everyone, welcome.
Thank you.
The first thing we're going to get into today really is this concept of nodes and the ability for these folks to create a business beyond mining, right? It's not just what Satoshi said is mining. The whole process of running a node is a real professional integration into the system, and certainly peers, right? These are peers, these are equals. So let's just characterize a bit first and tell us a bit about your background and how you've seen, because everyone on this panel has a historical perspective of what went on and can share that. So Xan, I'm gonna hit it off with you first.
Cool.
If we can keep it down a little bit, guys, it's a little hard to hear. We're hearing some feedback and all that stuff. But we're going to be talking a little about the history of nodes and how this industry's grown. So Xan, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was an early core team member of the Blockstack, or now Stacks team, back in 2017. And so yeah, I remember back then when we were ahead of this problem, and something we started thinking about when we launched the initial technology. A big part of it was more from a standpoint of, we want to get to a world that's peer-to-peer, but for right now, we need to bootstrap some level of node support on the network, because you want developers to come, you want them to build things. To your point, it's not just about mining. Anything you want to do on these networks requires not just nodes, but infrastructure built on top of nodes. And in a lot of cases, you can go to professional providers for that. But I think what we've really seen in both some of the more mature ecosystems, like Bitcoin, as well as some of the ecosystems that are now starting to mature more, like Stacks, is more and more of these businesses want to run nodes themselves. Because yes, they can rely on a professional provider, and maybe that can make sense as a fail-safe. But the amount of control it gives you over your business, the flexibility it gives you with your business lines when you start vertically integrating into a protocol services like that, I think is becoming more and more essential. And we saw this happen at first with exchanges, who became some of the biggest node runners on all of these networks. But we're seeing it happen with kind of every sort of service provider now, because of that value that it brings to the end use case that you're delivering.
So that service provision, and I'll turn it over to Micah, and service provision from node operators has grown over the years, and even just as far as what we consider vital infrastructure, all of that has changed a lot, and you've been involved in the infrastructure piece of the puzzle for years now. So, it started off with just on-ramps and off-ramps, and then it was much more than that. So if you can give us that historical perspective from early infrastructure around Bitcoin what being a node meant at that time, what being a peer meant at that time, and to what you see today with all of these provisions of staking and everything else that comes with running a professional peer-to-peer network. So Micah, and a little bit about your background and the bird's eye view you've had for all of this.
Well, I'm Micah Winkelspecht, and I was the CEO and founder of a company called Gem. We provide fiat on-ramps and off-ramps for a bunch of different crypto companies. And we were recently acquired by Blockdaemon, so I'm only 2 weeks into this. But I've been following Blockdaemon's success with Constantine. Constantine used to work for Gem and then spun off the company. So, but I think if you go back historically, one of the biggest problems that Bitcoin always had was we created an incentive model for running mining nodes. That was a very profitable enterprise, but we did not create proper incentives for running general nodes to create a large peer-to-peer network. And so it's always been a bit of a tragedy of the commons, as you said, or as Meltem said. And so what's changed, I think, recently is that there's now strong incentives for running node infrastructure that didn't exist before with all of these proof-of-stake networks and all these different ways of running blockchain networks. And so we've seen an incredible growth because of the incentive model that's so strong that large institutional players, large crypto companies can now put their money to work in these other networks. And so the node infrastructure market has exploded in popularity. Blockdaemon now has about $10 billion worth of tokens staked, over 50 protocols, and they have points of presence in over 70 different data centers, including the majors, Google Cloud, Amazon, but also bare metal providers to create a global distributed network across 50 different blockchain networks. So the scale of this industry has exploded, and I think the large reason why is that there is now a strong incentive model attached to it in the same way that there was a strong incentive model attached to mining Bitcoin. And that changed everything.
So Rodolfo, you're a VC, and you've seen and you've met some of the folks on this panel in the early days, and you've seen the industry grow. Now, when I think it was Coinbase who wrote the first large check to Blockdaemon, and I was working at Kraken at the time, and I said, whoa, that's not where I saw that number coming in. So, take us through that. You saw some of the first checks go into this industry of node provision and what it means. You've seen some of the original infrastructure pieces come into place. What did you think when you saw it sort of take a life of its own and start to get real definition around what the industry is, what the products coming out of it are, not just mining, but everything else that came after? So from a VC perspective, what does this little industry that's blossomed so much mean to you, and give us your bird's eye view on how you've seen this happen?
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, everyone. So I've been in Bitcoin and crypto since 2013. So I got to meet Meltem and Muniv early on, Micah, just been around the block for a while here. And actually our first investment within Foundation Capital, the firm I'm part with, is BlockCypher, which very early on was doing software around transaction confirmation back when it was not clear if somebody was trying to double spend on the Bitcoin network and so on. And at the time, it was not clear that institutions would want to run their own infrastructure, that they could run their own infrastructure. And so there was this idea that you could have some developers provision some infrastructure for somebody who's not an expert to be able to participate on the network. As Micah was saying, the incentive model for node running was not there. It was just this ideological component of the ledger has to be small enough so that a node can run on a Raspberry Pi, and you should run your own node because that's kind of what's healthy for the network. And this notion of 10,000 nodes became like a mantra of the ecosystem. And every time that the number dropped a little bit below that, people would start to freak out and so on. But beyond that notion of altruism and not let the network get overtaken, there was no incentive up until both the enterprise requirements started to get more material, and when the proof of stake network started to come around, where you could become actually a specialist in node running per se. So we got the chance to meet with the Gem team early on.
2014, I was just looking at the first email I sent to Rodolfo in 2014.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they funded our competitor BlockCypher, so.
Yeah. Well, and we met Bison Trails, and we met Blockdaemon, and it's been amazing to see all the opportunities now, not just node running, but then all of the additional services that can happen on top of node running, right? Like, because now there's a number of value-added operations that you can run on top of these nodes, and as we've learned over the years, there are tax implications from running your own nodes. There's flexibility in terms of the types of operations that you can do if you run your own node versus if you rely on a third-party provider. So the industry just keeps blossoming, and I actually think that there's going to be new waves of companies that emerge, just because by virtue of where the money is today, a lot of the existing players have either been acquired or are moving into enterprise-grade solutions, like where the minimum account balances need to be meaningful for it to be worth it for these players to pay attention. But now the next wave of developers that are just getting started, that want to play around, need to either provision their own infrastructure, and that just means that there's going to be new waves of RPC and developers that are going to run nodes for the new waves.
You know, historically, I remember the Brian Brooks, when he was in charge of the Office of the Controller of the Currency, and you remember in the summer of 2020, he came out and said, you know, all of these things are going to be okay for US banks and all these service provisions, and it was a lot of the stuff that came with running nodes and how that would operate. And if you remember, that's when the beginning of this node service provision industry really started, because that's when Coinbase came. Once again, I saw it from Kraken, and I said, there's only so many of these guys, and there's so many exchanges, therefore this is going to be a beauty pageant of very few participants, and therefore there's going to be a lot of attention placed on these. Now, when I look at what happened in the world, for example, since then, China and the mining situation, and Xan, you worked at Hong Kong for a lot of the time. Is there a geopolitical element to this piece? Like, China kicked out miners, sure, but what about all these service provisions that came along with the miners? Is that now geographically impacted, or is that something that we can still abstract and say it's just out there?
I do think it's related. You know, my 2 cents generally is I was always a little shocked with the degree to which they allowed all of this to exist in China, because it's so counter to the entire system. And I think they may have actually made a little bit of a miscalculation in terms of, you know, we can allow this to a point and limit the degree to which it will spread and it will kind of become an industry here. And it's kind of a mind virus in a way that you can't control in that way. So I think what we're seeing happen now, obviously mining has been kicked out for a while. Every meaningful miner has moved their stuff out of China a long time ago, and I think it's one of the healthiest things that could have happened for the Bitcoin network. You are still seeing development around assets. You know, NFTs are huge in China. They've actually come out and said, you know, NFTs are not crypto, they are collectibles. They are accessible on services like Alibaba. Alibaba has their own NFTs. But again, when it gets to the enabling infrastructure in the node level, it's a very different world where you essentially have a completely centralized and controlled back end. And so you don't have the same level of service providers that we're seeing kind of explode everywhere and you know, kind of this blooming of 1,000 kind of flowers to service this new industry. Instead, what you have is you have these teams that want to issue an end asset, like a collectible or some service that, you know, in some cases still has a token. And because of that, it's most of the time, they are just bootstrapping the infrastructure needs as much as needed, and it's really just this minimum viable infrastructure to enable that end use case. So it's very different, and I think what we'll continue seeing there, NFTs will continue being issued in kind of this centralized way. It works well with their centralized digital currency model that they are, the digital yuan, which they're rolling out in, you know, currently and over the next few years. But I do think you're going to see them push even the projects that are just issuing these end use case assets, fungible tokens especially, pushed out more and more from the country.
And then I guess, even all of their entrepreneurs aren't able to, let's say, leverage this new infrastructure that's getting built, like a lot of the American exchanges are.
Yeah.
Whatever came out of China can't just now offer these staking services, all these new products.
So briefly on that, I think we're still in a little bit of a gray area when it comes to just general development around these things. Because right now, I have a couple of engineers that sit outside of Shanghai, and they're fine right now doing development around these services. We're one of the bigger miners on the Stacks network, and so we've built out some of this node, and then on top of the node infrastructure, API infrastructure to service what we do, and then we've tried to generalize that to help other people doing the same thing. And right now, that kind of, I would say, crypto adjacent development where you're not issuing tokens, you're not, you're kind of creating that infrastructure, that's fine, but I'm already getting, early red flags that's even going to become targeted in the next few years. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to see what happens.
And targeted at a pretty vulnerable time.
Yeah.
Because we see what's going on with Infura and Ethereum, and the concept that maybe this could get shut down by politically connected, politically motivated people. And Micah, you brought up incentive models before, and how incentivized private businesses like exchanges are to add staking services and add professional node operation services. And there is an aspect of decentralizing as far as the incentives go to make sure that this has some resistance to political influence. Do you see that as a major a path for growth for the folks at Blockdaemon? Is this piece of not allowing the sort of choke points we saw in Canada to the financial system to replicate themselves? Because let's be honest, Canada is banana republic banking as it is. There's a handful of banks, and if they get a call, it was pretty simple to shut it all down. There's only so many people on their central ledger, and they all would know each other. So now we've got nodes that we don't necessarily know, we don't know if they're going to be in the same country. They could spin up anywhere, and we can actually start breaking the captive models of physical nation-state borders for financial infrastructure. Is that something on the roadmap for an infrastructure provider like Blockdaemon? Is that something you see, that new incentive models will allow you to go outside of countries, find new places, find new services that won't allow you to be vulnerable to whatever political whim is going on in that country at a time? Is that something you see?
Well, I think what you're really referring to is a general problem with building these large peer-to-peer networks, and it's always been a debate between centralization and decentralization. It's not one or the other, it's somewhere in between. And I think it's a major risk, honestly, for the industry if we don't have, if we only have a few infrastructure providers, and those infrastructure providers are running on the same stacks and the same data centers. That is a centralization risk for all of these networks, and it does exist, and it's a real problem. I think the way we're trying to attack it is by being essentially a Switzerland provider. So we're not married to any one cloud provider. We work on bare metal stacks. We are able to do white label services. We're able to do hosted services. We don't take a strong opinion on that, and we let our customers sort of decide what works for them. But it is a real thing that we think about. We don't want to become the largest infrastructure provider, and we don't want everybody to be relying just on our stack. Now, obviously, it's a financial benefit if everybody is, but I don't think it's good for the underlying networks. So our approach is to essentially build hooks into every single data center and make it extremely easy for our customers to launch nodes across 70 different points of presence so far, and we're increasing that every day. And that's globally. So being globally distributed, being distributed across data center providers, bare metal stacks, all of these things are really, really important. And the reality is, if you are, let's say, a large institutional customer and you want to run these nodes, for you to try to build that level of diversification across all these different jurisdictions and different providers, it would take a massive team of engineers to be able to just manage that level of infrastructure. And so the advantage that you get with a provider like us or some of the others, like Infura or whoever, is you get a team of engineers who are basically monitoring and managing all that. Additionally, you know, when you're running these nodes, you also have to think about things like high availability, right? So if these services go down, there's massive penalties against, you know, those node providers and slashing penalties. So one of the benefits of using these providers is that you get high availability guaranteed. And one of the things that we've done to take it a step further is actually to provide insurance policies against slashing. So if you're using our nodes, you basically do not take on the risk of slashing.
So there's a whole new risk management element there to integrate this into Wall Street type infrastructure.
Right. And so it just becomes a level of professionalization that, you know, large institutions would not be able to build on their own. And they're basically offloading all of that difficulty and risk to us. Yeah.
So integrating the machines into our responsibilities and obligations has other ramifications, let's say. And you know, how would you have seen how would it have been processed what happened when Amazon had that? I'm not sure if it was a DDoS or whatever it was that caused some Ethereum hiccups with the Infura about 2 months ago, if I recall.
Yeah.
How would that have been handled internally? And I'll pass it to Rodolfo. You know, from a VC point of view, what would that have looked like? You know, is that an opportunity for you guys? Do you say, oh, let's start providing options that don't fall into the same traps as Infura? Is that something you would see?
I think it's less around I think it's just more like with any other ecosystem, more diversity is good. Diversity in the stacks, diversity in the location of the servers, just so that you don't have as many single points of failure and there's less risk of contagion in some capacity. One of the things that I'm pretty interested at the moment is a number of the networks are creating incentives to engage directly with data center providers as a way to help a number of these, because data centers in some capacity are pretty commoditized businesses at this point where it's just private equity owned or smaller firms that basically just are a CapEx type of game, right? And so with a number of the networks that we're working with, is like, how do you create incentives where maybe they don't always take payment just in cash, but they take payment in tokens. And so they're incentivized to run nodes for the different networks that they participate in. And then at that point, then you also need to make the software to be easier to be run by these networks and so on. And so again, like, how do you keep creating these new types of incentives to increase the number of nodes available for all of these networks, right? Because I guess at the end of the day, you want to have more overlap in terms of availability for these different networks because they all have different functions, right? And so the more you have that, the more you create incentives on the other side, which is a network that has a couple hundred nodes is not going to be as attractive for, say, an exchange or a wallet provider to integrate with versus a network that has a ton more nodes, 10,000 nodes or whatever, and other availability, because then there's going to be more developers and so on, right? So like that part of the ecosystem needs to keep growing so that it's attractive for everybody else to come and integrate with and so on. And at least within the Stacks Foundation, that's some of the stuff that we talk about and think about and try to push for new ways to engage with a lot of these providers.
And I guess with all that pushing for new ways and all these new incentives, you know, you see Blockdaemon now acquiring other companies like Gem, and instead of them just being this technical service provider thing that an exchange or another customer-facing entity would hire in order to engage in order to deliver services, how much can we imagine these node service providers actually starting to get that customer-facing piece to them? Are they going to go out and put up a welcome sign and a little shingle and say, come in, hire us, to normal people? Or is it just going to be exchanges, you know, sophisticated counterparties, Wall Street types, or are in the same way that we see more peers joining Bitcoin or any other network, are they going to offer services that are more retail?
Yeah,
Is that in the?
So that's a great question. I mean, so my company Gem, we took a totally different approach. You know, Blockdaemon and Gem have always been approaching the same customers. We share several of the same customers. Our approach has actually been to build B2B2C tools. So these are tools that go inside of another app. but we do have touch points with the end consumer. So for example, Gem Onramp is a widget that sits inside of apps like Celsius Network or Shapeshift app, and users can buy and sell cryptocurrency from within that app. So I think that is actually a really unique model that allows us to continue serving all the different businesses inside of the crypto ecosystem, but increasingly you'll start to see us having more touch points with the end consumer. And we're looking to expand that. So they acquired us for the Fiat On-Ramp as a starting point, but we think that there's a whole menu of services that we can provide beyond just nodes and staking, but a full payments infrastructure that any app developer can plug into their application. Because really at the end of the day, it's all about specialization. You know, I think at this point, we want app developers to be able to focus on what they're best at and what provides the highest value to their customers, and not the plumbing. We'd love to be the plumbing.
And what about you, Xan? Is that something you guys are seeing too?
It is. You know, I actually think it's a really good point because, as we've correctly identified so far, there's a lot of consolidating or centralizing incentives and forces in this part of the business. And I think, you know, the B2B2C model and extending vertically into things like payment rails that you guys are doing matters a lot and is very meaningful. But to get back to your point about peers, I think it's really important for the future that we continue to look at ways of incentivizing and allowing not just the big professional providers to run this and offer these services, but individuals to become peers on the network. Because, you know, no matter what, if we lose the ability for an individual to have any meaningful chance at becoming a peer on the network, I think a lot of the underlying value of why this technology was even created, we start to lose a lot of that. And that's not to say that, you know, I do think there's probably going to be a majority of the market that is these massive service providers, but it's having the option and the correct incentives and the technical ability more and more for people to be able to be a peer on the network. A good example is, you know, Jack Dorsey at Block wants to change, and this is not an insignificant challenge to solve, but he wants to enable anyone to be able to run a Bitcoin mining setup, a basic one, at, you know, maybe marginal profit in their home. That's not viable today, but I do think missions like that are paramount for the future of the space generally, and these networks to really kind of maintain their status as enabling permissionless participation.
Well, you heard it. You got to run a node or have one of these node providers to be an actual peer, just like Meltem said at the last one. You know, you got to hold your keys. Same idea here. Peers are the ones running nodes, and they're not all equal, but be a node. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.